There was a poll where they asked the youth of various countries what you want to be when you grow up, and the answer of those 10 years olds was maybe YouTuber in the US, for example, and on the other hand, it was astronaut in China.
So who are you guys?
Sure. So I'm Blaine Curcio. I'm the co-host of the Dongfang Hour, and my day job, I'm the founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, a research and consulting firm in Hong Kong, and I'm also an affiliate consultant for a company called Euroconsult based out of Paris.
And I'm Jean Deville. I'm the other co-host of the Dongfang Hour. So my day job is actually working in the aerospace industry with something that's not exactly related to space, but in my other part-time passion is China and is space. And so when you put that together, that gives the Dongfang Hour. I also share some thoughts on a personal blog called China Aerospace Blog.
One of the things we haven't talked too much in past episodes of China Talk on space is launch. What is launch, and what are the dynamics particular to the Chinese space launch industry?
So the idea of launch basically is generally to put an object, a spacecraft, a satellite, in orbit around the Earth. And to do that, you have to reach a certain velocity. So that's just orbital mechanics, several kilometers per second. And in order to do that, you have to you need a launch vehicle to slowly gain all this speed, all this velocity, all this momentum. And so that's what launch is all about. And talking a little bit about the dynamics of launch in Chinese space, China historically has been so I'm speaking for anything before 2015, 2016, was rather, third, fourth, fifth in the number of launches. But over the past 5-ish years, probably, the numbers of launches that China has done is just astounding. Several times over the past 5 years, the country to put the most satellites into space. And so that is a reflection of a very active space program that relates to many things: communications, Earth observation, sat-nav, and just its space exploration program. So a lot of stuff happening currently in Chinese space and Chinese launch.
I was going to say, just I guess to add to that, I think at the moment in Chinese launch, one of the things that we're seeing is just a really incredible number of companies coming out of the woodwork. So we've seen more than 20 launch companies, and it's such that you now have companies that are many companies that are building rockets, but then you have a number of companies that are specializing in some kind of subsystems level type of area, like building specific Methalox powered rocket engines, for example. So yeah, definitely just a lot of diversity amongst these companies, and to some extent, but at the same time all building a product that is in a market that I guess will get commoditized at a certain point. Once you reach a certain number of launches, it's basically just sending things to orbit, and there are some kind of parameters, but in general, it's quite. I don't know how many of the companies will survive long term. There's a lot of different companies now.
So what are the metrics on which these firms are competing?
Well, I think you can look at these different companies from the perspective of technology. First of all, what type of technology they are using to put the spacecraft, their payload into space, and there's maybe the classic technology that's been used for many years already, which is to have a multi-stage rocket. The rocket is in several modules that dislocate as the rocket gets higher and higher. You put the satellite into orbit, and then the different stages of the rocket then disintegrate by re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. And then there's been since the Falcon 9 of SpaceX, there's been this strategy of saying, hey, we want to reuse the first stage. We want to reuse these various parts of the rockets. And then SpaceX has been doing that very successfully over the past few years. And so you can sort of segregate rockets between those that are expendable and those that are reusable. So that's technology perspective. You can get a lot more detail into the technology, what type of fuel they're using, what's the efficiency, what's the thrust to weight ratio. There's a lot of things to look at. But basically, I think that's one of the big differentiating factors between the rockets. What is their launch strategy? And the second point is how big your rocket is. How much payload is it able to put into orbit? And again, there are different strategies here. There are rocket companies that people who think you must make the biggest rockets possible, and that way you can have your rocket sort of works like a bus. You have a lot of passengers, that's the satellites, and then it makes, individually it makes launch much cheaper. And there are others that think that no, you should make rather small launch vehicles that only carry a couple of satellites, but that way you can have a much more tailored service to each satellite, can put it in exactly the right orbit.
Also, one other point to add that's a little bit more specific to China, I think, are sort of elements of geography and I guess sort of politics to a certain extent, insofar as you have certain launch companies that have set up in areas that are either geographically quite close to what might be either the future commercial launch site in Ningbo, for example, or just close to the coast and sort of near to Hainan. So for the two examples I would say would be Space, which is the sort of the launch company of the Chinese Academy of Sciences that they've set up in Nansha and Guangzhou. And basically Nansha, I mean, it's an island in the Pearl River Delta where you could literally, on a boat be out in the South China Sea within a couple of hours and be at Wenchang within like one day. And so you have a situation where they're building rocket manufacturing facilities in Guangzhou, basically with the sort of whole supply chain of, Guangdong, which is quite a lot of advanced manufacturing, if not directly aerospace related. And then you have, a relatively more livable place, Guangzhou, as compared to like, Hainan, which I mean is livable in some ways, but not if you're a young professional, I guess, in China. It's probably better to live in Guangzhou in a lot of ways. Well, I mean, nothing against Hainan, but I guess, more opportunities in Guangzhou, we could say, probably, all else equal. But yeah, no, it's fair. The best dim sum I've ever had was in Haikou, I think. But that's another, yeah.
There you go.
Literally the best dim sum I've ever had, and I lived in Guangdong for some time. But digressing, the other kind of geographic element that's quite interesting is the sort of cluster of companies building up around Huzhou. So you have Land Space with their facility there, and then a newer company called Rocket Group. And that's, again, close to the Ningbo commercial launch site that was announced in the sort of medium-term development plan of Ningbo last year. So, yeah, again, I think geography and kind of relationship with provincial governments and ability to get land, which was in the case of Huzhou, and I think also some investment, that's another sort of more, not as direct of a differentiator, but it still makes a difference, I think.
So one of the crazy things that SpaceX can do is land rockets. How important is that to the overall cost effectiveness of launch, and how close are Chinese firms to gaining that capacity?
There's been a debate for many years on how viable is vertical takeoff, vertical landing rockets, and historically, Europeans notably have been more reluctant about this type of technology. The Chinese, I think, in the early years, maybe in the early 2000s, although they've always they've always had some studies on reusable rockets. They have also had their reluctance, but now I think the overall global consensus is that this is just a great way to bring the costs of launch down. But there's a discussion on how, a minimum amount of launches that you must have every year to make it actually interesting to try to get your parts of your rockets back to reuse them. So anyway, there's a debate, but overall the consensus is that this is the way to go in order to bring your price down. And I mean, the proof is just the prices that SpaceX is able to propose to a lot of its customers compared to the more traditional Arianespace or other more traditional launch services providers. And China is on track of being able to achieve reusable rockets. They've had a number of almost all private companies, launch companies actually are working on rockets that look very similar to the Falcon 9, although with a much smaller payload. The idea is really to take off and to land vertically, to reuse the same first stage, to have an engine layout that looks very much like the Falcon 9, and some of these rocket companies in China are also using very similar fuels to what SpaceX is using. So the traditional liquid kerosene, liquid oxygen, or liquid methane and liquid oxygen. China has not had a fully operational reusable rocket just yet, but we've seen many very promising prototypes. For example, there's a company called Link Space that almost 2 years ago now, or 3 years ago, they did a vertical takeoff, vertical landing experiment with a prototype, and where we could see a rocket taking off, basically a single stage rocket, rise up 150 meters and then land back on the ground, which shows some good understanding and a very good mastery of these mechanics, the physics of vertical landing. We've had other companies also, typically Deep Blue Aerospace, but also iSpace, also called Interstellar Glory. These companies also are planning these first hops this year. And if all goes well, possibly we could see the first launch of the orbital launch of the very first vertical takeoff, vertical landing reusable rocket by the end of this year or early next year. So that they are moving very fast, and they're probably, in terms of this type of technology, they're probably the second country behind the US, I would think.
One of the reasons companies are interested in getting really cheap launch is the ability to put tens of thousands of satellites in the sky to give you a nice space internet. This is something which currently exists in a handful of Western competitors, SpaceX Starlink being the most prominent. But I'm curious for your perspective on Chinese low Earth orbit constellations.
Sure. So I guess low Earth orbit satellite constellations really have only come about in China over the last several years. So there was sort of a first wave of various plans, and then more recently we've seen a significant upgrade of those plans. So the first wave, which was around 2018, 2019, there were several, and I guess they still exist, programs that were being done by companies like CASC and CASIC, basically the usual suspects, large SOEs that are doing a lot of China's main space projects. And these programs in particular are called Hongyan and Hongyun. And these are a few hundred satellites, broadband constellations, similar, I think, in scale to the original, say, OneWeb low Earth orbit constellation plan, which would have been around 2015. And as we've seen in the West, where you had sort of this original, 600-ish satellite constellation from OneWeb get expanded to some few thousand, and then Starlink came in with, 10,000 plus, and then Kuiper from Amazon came in with, 10,000 plus also. We've seen in China these original plans, which again are only like 3 years old, and had originally been pledging, these companies were talking about like 20 billion RMB for these projects per project. These projects were really rapidly looking like they were going to be much, much smaller scale than these really huge constellations. And this became even more apparent when, in late 2019, early 2020, Starlink and SpaceX started launching like 60 Starlink satellites every 2 weeks, pretty much. And I remember I was at a conference at the end of September 2019, and the president of SpaceX, Gwynne Shotwell, she said, "Oh yeah, next year we're going to do every 2 weeks, 60 satellites per 2 weeks." And the people in the room, myself leading most among them, were like, that's crazy. That would be just ridiculous. Like that is inconceivable for the satellite industry, and they've pretty much done it. And so again, in China, we've seen this rapid acceleration in the scope, the scale of China's low Earth orbit constellation plans. And it's been quite cryptic, and you have to kind of pull together pieces of information from different sources, and it's still not entirely well defined in terms of an official source saying this is what we plan to do. But what we can generally derive is that they're looking at doing a 10-ish thousand satellite scale constellation in the next, decade or something like that, but being rolled out in the scale of, hundreds of satellites probably per year within a couple of years, let's say. And the interesting thing is that you have filings at the ITU that are GW1 or GWS, and there's a couple of different GW filings. And it's speculation, but a lot of people speculate that it would be Guowang, so GW, the sort of national network. And so these plans, they became quite a bit more well-defined earlier this year. Well, I guess there's just 2 points, I think, that are quite relevant to point out in terms of the development. So you had in April 2020, the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC, they added satellite internet to their list of new infrastructures alongside 5G and Internet of Things. So that gives you some idea of the level of importance that they assign to this, that it's in the same sentence as 5G. And so again, that was April 2020. And after that, you saw a handful of companies raise money to build factories, to build satellites. You saw state-owned enterprises like China Unicom, China Telecom, releasing satellite internet type of products into the market. And so you saw a very kind of immediate reaction at a relatively small scale, but still, big stuff going on. And then I think the second date that's significant would be like April of 2021, where we had the establishment of this company, China Satnet, which was established at a very high level, so directly under SASAC, so at the same level as China Telecom, China Unicom, CASC, CASIC, etc. And this China Satnet, which is headquartered in Xiong'an, in the new kind of capital planned district in Hebei, it's been staffed with sort of high-level people from many different state-owned enterprises, and it's all the usual suspects, CASC, CASIC, the telecom companies, and then CETC. And I think it's going to be really interesting because you have a situation where, in theory, they will be able to really kind of pick and choose amongst a bunch of different state-owned enterprises who are all trying to build, let's say, satellites and rockets. and also, in theory, a bunch of commercial companies that are building satellites and rockets. And the aforementioned at the very beginning of the Hongyan, which is a CASC project, had that project really continued to gain traction, which again it's still alive, but I don't think it's really gained that much traction. That would be probably heavily slanted towards buying CASC stuff because it's a CASC company basically. And so again, by having SatNet be at this just under SASAC level, it gives them quite a lot of influence, I think, and ability to be quite autonomous. So yeah, and then I guess just the last point that I'll highlight. So again, what we're likely to see now moving forward is SatNet is this company that's going to be the operating company of this constellation that's going to get built out over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. And it will essentially be kind of this global, a global space-based telecommunications network. So basically like a telco from space. And I do think it's quite, it's appropriate that it's been set up at the same level as the telcos because it is a telco from space.
And I think it's interesting how today, when we talk about China's satellite internet projects, how this is materialized by this Guowang, this China SatNet project. But 3-4 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. As Blaine hinted at a little bit, there were a lot of private companies having their own broadband SATCOM projects, constellations, such as Galaxy Space, such as many others. Some still sort of do, but most of them have moved up the value chain and decided that we are going to make the satellites and sell them to the satellite operators rather than operate a constellation, a broadband constellation in itself, because it is understood that today, operating a broadband SATCOM constellation is quite a touchy activity that is probably going to be reserved to state-owned companies. And as Blaine said, telco. You have the role of a space telco, and telco business. We know in China that is really a state-owned business. Typically, China Unicom, China Mobile, China Telecom. These different telcos.
Global markets are a mess right now. Evergrande is on the brink of collapse. The U.S. government may be a few days away from defaulting, and NFTs are making teenagers millionaires overnight. So how are investors supposed to navigate this potential nightmare scenario? Well, there is a glimmer of hope hidden in a corner market. It's one of the most underrated asset classes that billionaires have been investing in for millennia. It is blue chip art, ladies and gentlemen. Contemporary art pieces have outperformed the S&P by 174% between 1995 and 2020. Art is a $1.7 trillion asset class, projected to grow 58% in 5 short years, according to Deloitte. Masterworks is the first company to give ordinary investors access to this exclusive asset class, letting everyday investors invest in these works for a fraction of the typical $10+ million purchase price. In the past 2 years, they've been extensively featured in publications like the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and New York Times. I've partnered with Masterworks to allow you all to skip the waitlist. Just head to the special link at masterworks.io/ChinaTalk. Important disclosures at masterworks.io/disclaimer. Can you talk a little bit about the feedback loops between developments in the West and China? What has the impact of SpaceX been?
So I think the impact of SpaceX in China, there's kind of twofold impact, and I think one of them is quite China-specific, and then the other one is kind of more of a global impact. So I guess the global impact is just, you see SpaceX doing these amazing technical things or commercializing technology that was otherwise just impossible. And it inspires this generation of space industry people in China. So you see a lot of people that post stuff about Elon Musk, and, there's this really, and there's a lot of, as John alluded to in terms of launch, there's some, sort of technical inspiration, we could call it, in terms of companies that are doing things that are similar in terms of their use of certain technologies to what SpaceX is doing. And then I think at a more kind of China-specific level, you have the more kind of geopolitical impact, whereby SpaceX is doing things that are enabling the U.S. government or the U.S. military to have more robust capabilities in the space domain, and then by extension, I guess, in Earth, on Earth, in the sense that they would have access to lower cost rockets to launch anything they wanted into space. They would also have potentially global communications with a Starlink type of network, and we have seen the U.S. military and sign some contracts with Starlink for communications with very low latency, this kind of thing. And so I think that from that perspective, the Chinese government is one of the relatively few governments globally that has such a strategic sort of imperative to try to have a sort of competing or if not competing, sort of a network that would allow them to have their own network that they're relying on. In a similar way to satellite navigation, I guess, with Beidou, where, GPS existed and it was it's quite sufficient in terms of just getting global location services. But there's a certain level of reliance on somebody that you might not want to be reliant on. So again, I think Musk and SpaceX and what they have enabled in terms of the U.S. government has certainly been a sort of accelerant in terms of the Chinese government's, let's say, reform and opening up, if we can use a rather specific phrase, possibly not entirely correctly, but let's say of the industry and of this specific business model.
The Chinese really look very closely at what U.S. companies are doing, and you can see this, as Blaine said, multiple comparisons to Elon Musk. Every company is saying, they're the launch company saying they're the SpaceX of China. Some constellations say, we are the OneWeb of China. We are the Starlink of China. And so you can see that they are looking very closely at what's going on. And I think that the U.S. played a very significant role in as Blaine said, the opening up of the space sector due to just the emergence of new space in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. And that triggered China starting from approximately 2014 to decide to open up the space sector to private capital. And so that is what triggered the founding, the creation of so many private Chinese space companies. So definitely, I think this new space trend in China gets a lot of inspiration from what was going on in the U.S. And I think we also see this in other sectors beyond space.
One of the confusing parts of this whole Chinese effort to create their own LEO constellation is the fact that there are a ridiculous amount of base stations spread throughout all rural corners of China. If the market isn't necessarily there for broad consumer consumption in China for Guowang, what are the prospects for exporting this capability around the world?
Any constellation of sufficient size would be pretty much by definition at least somewhat global. I mean, they could certainly have capacity concentrated over China in terms of having more kind of shells or otherwise more, but in general it would be pretty much global capacity. And I think that it's not entirely clear right now what the commercialization strategy would be in terms of going international, but I suspect it would be a couple of things. So one, you'd have, I think, as part of the broader Chinese tech stack that is being exported abroad, so that would be things like telecommunications networks, or things like even, I guess, smartphones, or like, modems, or Xiaomi smart home type of stuff. You could imagine, and this is, it imagines an impressive degree of alignment of different companies and entities, but you could imagine some degree of kind of this comprehensive tech stack being exported that includes, in some instances, satellite internet or that some connectivity based on that, which would be something like a village Wi-Fi type of hotspot or something like that. And then I guess the other thing would be probably Chinese companies abroad, of which there are I guess Chinese companies abroad, potentially the Chinese military abroad or at home. And then again, I do think that the other element of why would they, what's the sort of the reasoning behind it and is from a cost perspective, it's large, but it's not that large. And it's sort of just a piece of national infrastructure, I think. It's just sort of viewed as something that is strategic in wanting to have this, similar to Beidou, the satellite navigation constellation.
Yeah, I think the business model for Guowang is probably much less clear than it is for Starlink, for example. Starlink, among other things, aims at serving underserved areas in the U.S. or in other parts of the world. And these areas exist, and the people in these areas probably have enough, purchasing power to be able to purchase this sort of service. I mean, the question is maybe a little bit different in China. The answer is a little bit different in China, I think. The broadband connectivity on the ground is already very good. And if you go in the most rural areas of China where really don't have that much connectivity, those are very, very poor areas in China. And I really question the ability of these people to buy satellite internet compared to other more basic needs, such as, I don't know, food, education, this sort of stuff.
To get Starlink installed in your house, it's like $600. SpaceX said it cost them $1,000 to manufacture the dish, and then they're charging $100 a month. This is more than what a rural farmer in China makes in a year. Yeah,
so I think that probably won't be the main customers in China for the Guowang constellation. It could be in other countries that have, not as good broadband network on the ground. And also you have other applications. You have mobile SATCOM, you have providing connectivity maybe to maritime applications, to oil and gas stations, to aircraft. There are also autonomous vehicles. There are many other applications that exist out there for this constellation. But I agree with Blaine that this is definitely seen as more as a national infrastructure more than, I think initially a business model that's going to make a lot of money.
What else is the Chinese government trying to export in terms of space-related services?
I think that BeiDou is also a very big project that China is trying to export. So China completed its BeiDou, its third generation sat-nav constellation in 2020. There are multiple satellites, sat-nav satellites in medium Earth orbit. You can have some others in geostationary orbit and geosynchronous orbit, and these provide a wide variety of services that can be that are very similar to GPS, and the level of service depends on where you are situated on the planet. China definitely is pushing forward BeiDou. You have a lot of BeiDou projects that are along the Belt and Road. You have also state-owned enterprises that are a big promoter of BeiDou products, and and China also is very aware of the current deteriorating relations between the US and China. And one of the main ideas behind BeiDou is also replacing any GPS dependent systems by BeiDou. And that is something also that through their state-owned enterprises, they are trying to push overseas, notably along the Belt and Road.
I think we've seen this interesting evolution over the past, say, 15 years in terms of the different space-related things that China has been exporting. So you have one company, China Great Wall Industry Corp, so CGWIC, which is a subsidiary of CASC, and they're basically a broker for international business for things that are purchased from CASC. And so that would be like if you are Venezuela, like countries that have bought satellites from China this way have included like Venezuela, Nigeria, Pakistan, Laos. And basically they would buy a satellite, they would buy the launch service, they would buy insurance, they would buy oftentimes sort of a gateway type of thing. So a bunch of satellite dishes on the ground that would be controlling the satellite. And you would also sometimes get sort of like technical training and this kind of thing. And so these would be $200 to $300 to $400 million turnkey projects. And I would also point out that this is something that Boeing and Airbus also, they have a quite good business doing this, selling these satellites to countries as a way of connecting unconnected areas in developing countries. And so, again, we've seen this transition from selling these very big satellites, which was a decent business for China from, say, 2005 until about 2017, 2018. They started selling fewer and fewer, I think. And to now selling more kind of services and other kind of value-added, services using the existing infrastructure. So like BeiDou type of services. So the example would be like China Great Wall. They just opened an office in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, or they announced the opening of an office within this year, just a couple of weeks ago. And they're going to be, trying to commercialize BeiDou related products and services in Cambodia. And again, I think it's a very big difference from 10 years ago when CGWIC, the same company, was brokering a satellite deal with Laos. It's been interesting to watch that transition.
And you can also see a similar pattern, for example, with the meteorology data coming from the Fengyun satellite. So you see these patterns across various subverticals of the space industry. China has a number of Fengyun satellites that are orbiting the Earth and that are taking pictures of the Earth for meteorology purposes. And China has been promoting Fengyun data to Southeast Asia countries, to other countries around the Belt and Road, making this data available. So it's sort of this idea of Belt and Road Space and Information Corridor. That's the name I think that gave sort of a space segment of Belt and Road, and it's to make available all sorts of space services to these countries as part of Belt and Road.
So what is PrideSat, and how does it play into China's space export ambitions?
So basically, PrideSat would be kind of the satellites that I mentioned earlier of like LaoSat-1, for example, which was this $200 million turnkey satellite sold to Laos. You've also, again, had satellites sold to Venezuela, Bolivia. And these satellites are, satellites that a developing country would buy in order to do things like, sometimes it would be, broadcasting national TV channels to a country that has people in a very geographically distributed area. And that could take up as much as like, half a satellite. Let's say you could, if it's a big country with lots of TV channels. And then you would also have things like ATM networks or rural schools, this kind of thing being connected by a satellite. And again, China had sold probably about 12 to 15 of these over that decade or so, or 12-year period of like 2005 to 2017, and quite a few that were just quite. I think my favorite one was Belintersat, which they sold to Belarus, and it remains in orbit, and I think it's broadcasting quite a few Belarusian channels, and it's quite a mission. But anyway, I think that what we've seen, or what we will very likely see moving forward, is a similar trend to what I mentioned earlier with satellite navigation or with other verticals, which is this transition from exporting these big turnkey satellites to exporting kind of services. And so in this case, it would be exporting communication either via a Chinese constellation, as we just discussed, or potentially even via like China Satcom. So China has its own satellite operator, China Satcom, primarily geostationary, like very large satellites, mostly broadcast. And they are also building out a global network of high throughput satellites, so like very big geostationary satellites. So separate to China's constellation plans, they're just building out a network of, I think at the moment they have 3 very large satellites planned. And so again, as opposed to a country buying, say, a PrideSat previously, which they might well have done, I think now it's easier to buy a lot of capacity on a satellite if it's available.
Talk a little about the process of commercialization and opening up this industry to players outside of SOEs.
Sure. So what we've seen, I guess, is that in China, there's been this relatively gradual opening of the industry starting around 2014. Prior to that, everything in China in the space sector would have been CASC, which is the China Aerospace Science Technology Corporation. And then a relatively smaller amount would have been CASIC, which is largely subcontracted through CASC. And so starting in 2014, the government allowed private investment into certain verticals in the space sector. And over the last 7 years now, we've seen more than 100 commercial companies coming into the industry. And I think that if we compare it to the West, where you have a lot of the biggest, most innovative companies are private companies like SpaceX and even Boeing and Airbus and these other very large established companies. They're private, and in China, almost all of it is the government, or is CASC, which is the state-owned enterprise. And so now we've seen this gradual commercialization, and we're starting to see, I think, more as there becomes more larger space projects, and CASC basically gets busier and busier with what they have on their plate. A lot of the other stuff is just going to end up going to commercial companies as kind of a side effect of the ambitions of sort of the government and of CASC, I guess, to a certain extent. And so it's a very different type of commercialization, I think, relative to what you're getting in the US, where it's more kind of the market has allowed companies to just kind of develop as they do, and that's kind of where a lot of the demand is coming from. Although also, I guess, in the US, a lot of demand is NASA and others as well.
How are European companies trying to navigate between these rising US-China tensions?
China is a big market. It's a big space market. There's always the question for European companies, do we go to the US? Do we go sell our products to China? Do we do both? Can we do both? If we do both, will one of the countries, do something in order to prevent us from selling in the, the other country? And so there's always this dilemma, definitely, for a lot of European countries. And I think the US, the US market is a lot more straightforward for quite a few European companies, either to grow, either to sell their products, because, there's this just proximity, and there's this more understandable ecosystem, whereas China is definitely sometimes a black box for multiple reasons. But it's also a less, much less mature market with its own opportunities for European companies. So, of course, it depends on the subvertical here. But yeah, basically these are 2 markets that countries are looking at. And I know some companies that are working in the U.S. and that have put aside their Chinese projects. Mynaric, for example, Laser Space Comms is one such example. And there are also European companies that are, there are fewer of them, but there are some that are also doing this the other way around.
What's the vibe like in the China space world? And how does it compare to the sort of off the charts levels of optimism that I've encountered in the space people I've met in the West?
I would say there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of new companies being created all the time. And there's also just a really interesting camaraderie. So I'll give one example. I was at a conference in Wuhan in 2018 or 2019, and it was this big dinner with a very large circular table, and all of the different commercial launch companies were around the table, and there were 5 or 6 different companies represented. And then Xbase, which is the big CASIC subsidiary that had raised a couple $100 million from CASIC, and they were kind of the godfather of sorts. At the end of the night, it was like, oh yeah, Kasich, they're the host tonight, so don't worry about any of that. And so it was very all of the commercial launch companies were getting their dinner on Kasich, on X Space, which was an interesting kind of camaraderie in the sector. And then I think the other element that's I think kind of similar to the West, although at the same time it's probably a somewhat larger percentage of the population, is just this sort of increasing popular awareness of space in general. So we saw, for example, last year, Bilibili launched their own satellite, which is basically a high-definition video satellite, and they have on Bilibili.com, there's a dedicated kind of like Earth from Space channel with, cool video shots of the Earth from this video satellite that they launched. So that was pretty interesting. You also saw Xiaomi at one point, I think, launch a smartphone, and they took a photo, I think, of the Earth, or using a smartphone camera, maybe not the whole phone. But yeah, so I think there's just this kind of popular awareness around space, and I guess the last example of that I'll give, and then I'll hand it off to John, is the pilgrimages that you see of people going to Hainan to see the Long March 5B and Long March 7 launches. So you have in China the large commercial, I guess the commercial or the spaceport for the largest rockets is in Hainan in Wenchang. And so you've now had 4 times, I think, the Long March 5 or 5B has launched, and then the Long March 7, which are these really huge rockets that launch from the seaside with a beach right there, and there's a Hilton hotel with balconies overlooking from very far away, overlooking the launch pad. And you see this pilgrimage of literally hundreds or I guess maybe thousands of people going down to Hainan for these launches. And in the most recent one, you had the Xi'an Orchestra, or the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra or something, playing on the beach in like full-on tuxedos with the Long March going on in the background. It was pretty incredible, some of the footage coming from that. So yeah, there was a lot of popular awareness, I think, of what's going on in the industry now.
And to just expand a little bit on space culture, definitely I think China has done a very good job of making a topic that was initially quite, not, I wouldn't say unpopular, but definitely not one of the top topics that are discussed among young people, into something that has really been gaining attractivity. And we can trace this back to, well, let's say before, maybe 10 years, 15 years ago. As Blaine mentioned, space was something that was done by state-owned companies, and the interest from the Chinese youth has shifted progressively from when a young person in China from a good university graduates, their dream generally is not to join large state-owned enterprises anymore. There's companies like ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, all these big tech companies have gained attractivity, and because it pays better, because there's more dynamism than in state-owned enterprises. And so space did not have a very big appeal to Chinese people until a few years ago. And China has done a very big effort in trying to make space more attractive. So that has been, for example, putting together this annual event that they call China spaceThe, that has been taking place every year on the 24th of April since 2016, where it's during 2 days. You have a lot of space conferences, space outreach events all around the country. You can be observing the sky with a telescope. It can be conferences. It can be drawing competitions, drawing the moon, drawing Mars, drawing space exploration for lower school students. There's really a lot of stuff like that going on. And when you couple that with the fact that there is an emergence of private space companies, and these companies are raising a lot of VC money, so you have sort of a tech vibe, a vibe that comes from the tech industry that you had maybe in 5 or 6 years ago. Now space definitely is something that's becoming much more cool for the Chinese youth. And I think there was a poll, although I don't know how reliable it was, I think around 2 years ago, where they asked the youth of various countries, what you want to be later on when you grow up, and the answer of those 10 years olds was maybe YouTuber in the US, for example, and on the other hand, it was astronaut in China. Again, I don't know what was the amount of people they asked and in what conditions, so I don't know how reliable this poll is, but it does give an idea of how more cool space is becoming in China.
Yeah, I mean, come on, no knock on content creators. There are 3 of them on this podcast right now. We just saw China launch a Mars rover a little while back. What are the broader plans and ambitions for Chinese space exploration?
So China has a very ambitious space exploration program. This concerns the low Earth orbit. They're currently building a space station that will be completed by next year. They also have a very ambitious lunar exploration program that's currently already undergoing. They've already sent 5 missions, and there are 3 others upcoming in the next 5 years approximately. And they've just achieved, well, they've begun to achieve their first Mars mission, lander mission and rover mission in the last couple of weeks, where China landed the Zhurong rover, and which will be active for at least normally the next 3 months, and will be sending a lot of scientific data as well as amazing pictures back to the Earth. China has also some longer-term goals, which are also fascinating. We know that in the end of the 2020s, they're planning a sample return mission from Mars. They also have a mission that's called Zhenghe that will visit an asteroid and bring back a sample. There's another mission called Gande that will visit Jupiter and one of its moons. You have the interstellar heliosphere probe that will go to the very frontier of the heliosphere to do space sciences. So a lot of cool stuff, and a lot of things that can be inspiring for a lot of non-space people, because some of it concerns also crewed space missions. So sending people to the moon. That is something also that China has in mind. It's called the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Center. Currently, we're sort of seeing these 2 parallel projects. You have the Artemis program that's US-led, and that with which a lot of European countries and other countries around the world, Japan, Australia, they collaborate together. And on the other hand, you have the ILRS, which is China-led, but Russia has signed a memorandum of understanding to take part in this ILRS. And so we're sort of having these 2 lunar exploration programs that are undergoing in parallel. So it's really very exciting times for space exploration.
And I think just a small point to add to that would be, I guess, the activities as well with the Chinese space station that was recently launched, and the fact that will soon maybe be the only human space station in low Earth orbit if the ISS is not extended. And so you'll have a situation where really a lot of the large-scale international projects are being led by China, and occasionally, again, with these international partners like Russia that are bringing quite a lot to the table technologically, or even, I mean, sort of, you could say, smaller scale international partners that are doing things on specific missions. And so that would be things like, for example, you've seen in the Pakistani media, I think it was the current or the former prime minister that was talking about wanting to send the first Pakistani person to space, and it would be to the Chinese space station. You've also seen announcements of international collaboration with China and Italy on, I think it's Chang'e 6. And so again, you're seeing these larger projects that are really only China and the US and to some extent ESA have the scale to do these very large scale projects in a lot of instances. And so if you're one of the other couple hundred countries that might want to do some sort of space exploration or space science or this kind of thing, you're oftentimes doing it with China as a partner.
Just one last shout out to the Dongfang Hour podcast and the China Aerospace blog. I have read the entire back catalog, and as someone who is lazy sometimes and wants to read about China in English instead of in Chinese all the time, there are no 2 better guides out there than John and Blaine, so do consider signing up for their content. Thank you so much.